has been reprinted since the Jury Journal of Coastline College. His short story, Alter Ego, has been published in literary venues in England, India, and USA. When he isn't writing or teaching, he likes to read in 3 languages with a preference for fiction works in English. Sir, we are privileged to have you with us today, and we welcome you to the dais. Now, it is my privilege to welcome Ms. Anne Morgan. Anne Morgan is a writer, speaker, and editor based in Folkestone, UK. Her book, Reading the World, How I Read a Book from Every Country, published as The World Between Two Covers in the US, explores the big ideas that emerged from her year-long journey of reading a book from every country in 2012. This project has since grown into a lifelong endeavor, and Anne now dedicates much of her time to corresponding with readers, writers, and translators around the world, as well as championing the sharing of stories that are often overlooked by the Anglophone publishing industry. In addition to her non-fiction work, Anne is the author of 2 novels, the international bestseller Myself and Crossing Over. When she is not writing and speaks at events and leads reading workshops both in person and online. As a producer of the Loyal Literary Fund's Writers Aloud podcast, she enjoys engaging with other writers about their creative processes and also offers mentoring and editing services, drawing on her extensive experience working with some of the UK's leading newspapers and magazines. Ma'am, we are very much honored to have you with us today. We welcome you to the dais. Now, we formally begin our session in depth. Without further delay, I hand over my session to the dais. Thank you.
I would like to begin first by saying thank you for having me. I am very honored to be able to be here and invited to this University International Festival. Right. Okay. I figured it out. And so I feel truly honored to be able to be here. Thank you, Focal, and thank you, the Durga University. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you, Anne Morgan. 4 weeks ago, I didn't know you. Then Raoul Jain put us into contact via email. We had a short and heartfelt exchange. And since then, I got to know you and your work a little better. Maybe not too well, but a little better. And I realized Anne does a lot in terms of literature. She has 4 books published, 2 of non-fiction and 2 of fiction. And she's regularly invited to literary festivals and events all over the world. And you even teach your incomprehension course, in which you talk about not knowing in reading. So, first question is it fair to say that you're a literary activist?
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me, everyone. Literary activist, that's a term that I sometimes use, I suppose, on my social media handles and things. And I would like to think that I'm a literary activist, in the sense that I see my role as championing stories by underrepresented voices and voices that we don't hear from as much in Anglophone publishing. And that's significant because books published in English are still they account for the largest number of books published in the world. And when you take into account second language speakers, as most of the people in this room are, English is the most spoken language in the world. So Chinese, Mandarin and Spanish have more native speakers or first language speakers, as we might say, but English, when you count all the second language speakers, it's the most spoken language in the world. So if your voices are heard in English, if your stories are heard in English, if your books are available in English, you have the biggest global reach. So it's really significant which books are available in English, who is listening to in English, because that is really the global language of the moment. It may not always be, that may change, but for now, that is the loudest megaphone to speak through. And so when I realised this really when I set out to try and read a book from every country, and it wasn't possible to get hold of books in translation from every country in the world back in 2012. It's still not quite possible now, although since my project, a number of more books have come through. Some translators, in fact, because of my project, have gone to countries and found books to bring through into English in order to have some representation for those literary cultures in English. During my project, the most extraordinary story that happened was concerned the African island nation of Sao Tome and Principe, which is a Portuguese-speaking nation. And now I had assumed when I started my project that it would be quite easy to get literature from countries where a European language was one of the official languages, because there are lots of people who speak and translate from those languages. But in terms of African nations, that was often very much not the case. And many French-speaking and Portuguese-speaking, and even the one Hispanophone nation, we have an Equatorial Guinea writer here at the festival, the one nation in Africa where Spanish is the official language. Those countries have very little available in English translation. Sao Tome and Principe was a particularly difficult case. And I had done all sorts of things to get manuscripts from nations around the world where there wasn't something I could readily buy. And often that had been by contacting scholars, by contacting writers and translators and saying, is there anything available? And sometimes someone would share a manuscript with me. But in the case of Sao Tome and Principe, I kept trying, and I was a real pain, I was a pest. I was emailing so many people, anyone I could find on the internet who had a connection with the country, doctors working there on placement, students taking gap years there, charities working in the region. And everyone kept saying, sorry, we don't know anything that you could read, there's nothing available, nothing has come into English. Even, people hadn't translated things unofficially. And it was getting quite desperate. It was getting towards September of my year of reading the world, and I had set this goal to try and read the world in a year. And I even had a book deal by this point. I was supposed to write about this adventure, and I really thought this is not going to work. So my husband said to me, well, why don't you see if you can get people to translate a book for you? And I was like, who's going to want to do that? No one's going to want to give up their time, to help some unknown person in London do this crazy project. Well, he said, well, what have you got to lose? So I put a call out on social media asking if there were any Portuguese speakers who might be prepared to help me with my task. And within a week, I had more people volunteering than I could involve in the project. And they included a huge number of people, including a woman called Margaret Costa, who is one of the world's leading Portuguese language translators. She translates the Nobel Prize winner, Jose Saramago. And she emailed me, she said, I've heard what you're doing, I'd like to offer my services and help you. And it was everyone from her to someone I was at school with years ago who did Portuguese for a couple of years at university. So I had 9 people who volunteered. And I found a collection of short stories by a writer born in Sao Tome. And I bought enough copies to send one to each of his volunteers. And within 6 weeks, these strangers, the only person I knew was my old school friend, everyone else was a stranger from online. Within 6 weeks, they all sent back to me their translations of the stories I had asked them to translate from this collection, and I had the whole book to read. And the really happy afterword to this story is that last year, after 13 years, that collection was finally published in English, with Margaret Costa. Margaret Costa edited it and made it into a publishable book, and it was the first published book by a writer from Sao Tome and Principe. shows you that I just tell that rather long story to show you some of the challenges, some of the imbalances that there are. There's a whole country full of people that had absolutely nothing representing them in the world's largest spoken language. And that obviously one book is just a drop in the ocean. We need more than one book. One book can't stand for a country. I mean, well, India, how could you choose one book for India? That's a crazy idea, you know, and something I had to think carefully about for my project. But anyone would find that a difficult idea, but it's a start at least. It maybe opens the door for other voices to come through.
Thank you, Anne. In your latest book, Relearning to Read, Adventures in Not Knowing, you mentioned reading well. Is reading well to you about being right?
Yeah, so Relearning to Read is a quirky book. It's a strange book. It kind of comes out of my Reading the World adventure, but it's a book that took me years to realise I needed to write. And it was because when I set out to read the world, there were many technical challenges, many practical problems. I was working 5 days a week, and I had to find time to read one book every 1.87 days and review it, as well as researching and finding and choosing books and all that with working 5 days a week. There was the issue of finding books in translation. There was the issue of choosing. How on earth do you choose? As I mentioned, India was a particularly hard choice. But there was also a deeper sort of existential problem, which was that I realised the way that I had learned to read wasn't going to work when it came to reading books in translation from all over the world. Because, and I don't know if it's the same for you, those of you who are studying, but the education system that I was raised in was about being right, being clever, getting the right answer, doing well in your exams. And of course that's important, and there are lots of useful things that come out of trying to hone your skills and achieve well. But there is a problem, which is that it carries the implication that there's one right way of reading, and that if you can't explain everything in something you're reading, you're failing. Now, when it comes to reading internationally, no matter who you are, no matter how many languages you speak, how many countries you've been to, there will come a point where you don't understand something. Because no one can be an expert in all the world's literatures and languages. It's thought more than 6,000 languages spoken in the world today. So even the most erudite professor, and there are some extremely erudite and learned professors who've written about world literature, even they cannot be experts in everything. And for me, when I was doing my project, I had been trained as a literature student that the way that you write about literature is you do lots of contextual reading, and you analyse very carefully how the language works, you look for the metaphors, and you tease out the significance. So you might look at a passage of Shakespeare and say, oh, in Shakespeare's day, corn was threshed using this particular method, and so this metaphor means that the character is tired, but also perhaps resentful of his brother, and there are lots of rich understandings and interpretations that we can pull out. But I wasn't going to be able to do that when it came to my project, because I had, as I said, 1.87 days for each book. So even just reading that one book was a challenge. There was not going to be any time for any research. And when it came to books that came from traditions that I had no knowledge of, that I'd never read anything from before, there was going to be so much I didn't understand. So many references that would go over my head, so many jokes that I wouldn't be able to be certain if they were funny. Maybe I wouldn't even be able to know if a story was a funny story or a happy ending, because it might work so differently. So I was really nervous about this, and I thought at first, oh my god, I'm going to look really stupid, because I had promised to record this project on this blog, and I was going to have to write about every book. And there was just going to be so much I was going to get wrong. But I realised that what I had to do was make the limitation a strength, and be honest that I didn't understand. There would be lots I didn't understand. And so I gave up the idea of trying to read well, be a fit reader, be clever about books, and instead be open and honest and curious, and ask questions, and see if I could still have a meaningful reading experience in spite of the fact that there were many things that I wouldn't be able to understand. And this book, Relearning to Read, Adventures in Not Knowing, is the result of that long process, which is an ongoing process. It's something I continue to challenge myself on, to change my mind about. Each chapter looks at a different aspect of that. So there's a chapter on humour, is what you do if you don't know if something's funny. There's a chapter on politics, what do you do if you're reading a book that comes from a political viewpoint that's very different to your own. or a chapter on religion. And in fact, Brugge had a hand in this book, because the Incomprehension workshop that David mentioned, I ran here last year and the year before. And the first year in particular was the best version of that workshop I've ever done. I was so amazed by the students here, by how excited you were, how engaged you were, the intelligence, the imagination, the real appetite for exploring and playing with the ideas and asking questions. So in that spirit, I was saying to David, I have a copy to give away for the best question asked at the end of this session, okay? So no pressure, but this is about curiosity, okay? So the most curious person will get a signed copy of this at the end of the session, okay?
I think that's pretty cool. You mentioned American literary critic Stanley Fish describing reading as an immersive experience in which readers collaborate with the text in order to create meaning. Does meaning to you depend on the reader?
I think meaning is an interesting concept. One of the main theories that come out in this book is that because we can't understand, there's so much we can't know about many things we read. And when I talk about reading, I often mean more than just reading books. I mean reading situations, reading people, reading dynamics, reading the world in the broadest sense. So we can't be certain what was intended in many cases, or what the objective meaning is. But what we can have more idea about is ourselves. We can learn to read ourselves better. So we can be more mindful of our conditioning, of the forces that have shaped our thinking, of the voices that we've been trained to listen to more or to privilege, and the ones we may have been trained to ignore or push to the side. And we can try to read with those things in mind and try sometimes to push against those biases that we may have absorbed. No one can ever be perfect at this. No one can ever step fully outside their own head. There will always be blind spots. But by being more aware of that, we can attune our interpretation, our interaction, and generate a meaning that is more nuanced, I think, is more informed by our own partial standpoint. And I have to say, biases, often people, when they talk about biases, they talk about it in a negative sense. The truth is we're all biased. That's how we work as human beings. Our minds are wired to use shortcuts. And that's very practical in many situations. If we had to reinvent the wheel every time we encountered a different situation, we would never get anything done. So it's useful that our brain learns that in this situation, this tends to be true. But as we all know, there are biases that can be based on bad information, on historical injustice, on prejudices. And when that's the case, and when those are unexamined and they sit in our minds, and all of us will have absorbed some element of that, those can be very damaging. So it's kind of trying to step back and notice when something has an odd effect on you. So in the Incomprehension workshop, it's often a case that when someone doesn't understand something, it might trigger irritation in them initially. Because sometimes, many of us raised in a system where getting the right answer is important, we feel shame when we don't understand. And some of us hide that from ourselves by telling ourselves, oh, there's something wrong with this. This is badly written. It's not for me. And we blame the book rather than ourselves. So I often say to people when they feel that flash of irritation or impatience, when they think something's bad, particularly if it's something that comes from a tradition that is outside their usual familiarity, to stop and have a think. Is there something about this text that is challenging me or threatening me or forcing me to think differently? It might still be that it's a bad book. I'm not saying there's no such thing as a bad book. There are bad books, I believe. But I think particularly when it's something that comes from an unfamiliar world, we owe it to ourselves, and it generates a much richer interaction with the world if we can pause and think, I'm going to notice that I felt that and ask myself about it and wonder about it too.
I'm going to come back to this kind of resentment or feeling that may emerge from reading and not knowing, just in a bit. Yeah, right. I started to be a translator. I'm a translator by trade. And during my studies, I came across the phrase, all translators are writers. So I found that in your book, Relearning to Read, again. And you elaborate this a little further, saying that all writers are translators.
Yes.
So I thought that's... How do you mean that?
Yeah, because, well, I think it's really, English is a brilliant language to think about this in, because there are actually many Englishes, okay? So there are speakers of Indian English who don't speak exactly like me. There are speakers in the UK who speak quite differently to me, who use different words, different accents, different ways of saying things. So within English, there are different Englishes. But I think all of us beyond that, live in our own private world of experience. And when we sit down to write a story or to write something, it doesn't have to be fiction. When we sit down to write anything, we're trying to translate our own private experience into something that other people can read. So even if we're working just in one language, we're translating our personal experience. So in a strange way, rather than thinking about translation as a very separate idea and then writing in one language as a different discipline, I think it's a spectrum, actually, where maybe all books and all writers find their place somewhere along that spectrum. And yes, of course, if someone were to buy the rights to this book and translate it into Assamese, that would be obviously someone translating the book. But I think there's a grey area in the middle, and things are less clear cut than perhaps we often talk about it.
Not knowing, you describe not knowing as accepting the possibility to be wrong, to be mistaken. But when I read that, I thought, that's like a misunderstanding between the text and myself, or the reader. And misunderstandings, be they between people, in human interactions, or in other ways, often bear frustration. How can you accept not knowing or embrace not knowing without that frustration? Or maybe overcome that frustration? Because no one likes to be frustrated.
Yeah, you can't. And no one likes to be frustrated, but you can improve your tolerance to it. So it's not about, this is not easy. It's a pain, and sometimes it's really tiring. And there are days when I exhaust myself. And there are days when I sink into a comfort beat that is going to feel very familiar and safe and easy. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I think all of us have our things that we love, things that are precious, partly because they're familiar and they reflect back the world to us as we feel it is. And I'm not saying here that you should give up reading those things or give up watching those shows or listening to that music or whatever it is that is your comfort. So that's precious. That's a reminder of who you are. That's something precious. But this is about, it's a bit like exercise. Exercise can be challenging. It can be unpleasant. It can be, you can be running and get a stitch or have a cramp or whatever, and you don't enjoy it. But the benefits over time are there. Your capacity increases, and the more you do it, the more you're able to do. And the further you can go, and the more you can push yourself. And that it doesn't mean the discomfort ever totally goes away. But it's actually learning to change your relationship to that discomfort. That it's okay, actually, to feel frustration. It's okay to find something challenging and to not know the answer about it, and accept that maybe you never will know the answer about something. Not everything can be Googled. Or it may be that the answer will come to you years down the track, or that the book will teach you the answer by showing you more about the world that your mind is operating in. So it's really more about increasing tolerance rather than banishing frustration. I still feel frustrated when I read things. There are certain things but I notice that frustration now, and I think it's an interesting tool. It tells me that there is something there that maybe if I spend some time thinking about it will yield an interesting insight, perhaps into the story, but perhaps also into me, and something about how I work and how I relate to the world. So yeah.
How do you feel about footnotes?
Well, David's asking this partly because there's a chapter in this book that deals with footnotes. And I'm a bit mischievous. And this book, I should say, it sounds quite serious, but it is quite playful and mischievous. And perhaps one of the most mischievous chapters is the chapter on footnotes, where I write some rather weird footnotes to the chapter. And I do it to show that footnotes have to be treated with caution, I think, because they can, without us perhaps realising it, carry all sorts of assumptions and implications that might colour our reading of the text. So I open each chapter with an extract from a different book that is likely to be unfamiliar to many readers. And many of them I've used in comprehension workshops. And in fact, one of the extract I used for the footnote chapter, I used here in Zeebrugge the first year I did the comprehension workshop. And one of the reasons I love that extract is because it has a footnote, which I think is problematic. But I may be wrong about that because, of course, I can't be certain. So the extract comes from an extraordinary book called the Book of Llewellyn, which is, to this day, probably the only, if not one of the very few books ever published by a citizen of the Federated States of Micronesia. And this book was written by a writer called Llewellyn Bernhardt in the 1950s. Now, Llewellyn was dying, and he wanted to get down everything he could remember about his nation, all the history he could remember, all the myth, all the personal stories, everything, it all went into this book. And some of the book he dictated to his daughters, who also wrote it down. And at points he says, I'm running out of time, someone who comes after me will have to read and correct this later. He was in a rush because he knew his time was short. And then 20 years later, some academics at the Australian National University studied the dialect he spoke, Pompey, and translated that book into English. And they produced a companion text to go alongside it about the language, and they used copious footnotes. And it's extraordinary the work they did. I mean, it's a very rare book, and it's extraordinary that it's accessible to read in English. But some of their work, I think, carried some of the assumptions and prejudices of their day. And the footnote to this particular extract, there's a word house in the story that's being told. And the footnote says, evidently a rock shelter rather than a true house. And I thought, that's interesting, because that footnote is putting a wall between the English language reader and the original writer. It's saying, dear simple Llewellyn Bernhardt, he thought a rock shelter was a real house. We know what a house really is. And to me it felt really smug and snooty. And it carried quite an insidious bias that encouraged the reader to look down on Llewellyn Bernhardt. And so I used that as an example, and then I'd say to play with that idea, I introduce all these strange footnotes and ask the reader to think what they add, what do they take away. I think footnotes, I've changed my thinking. There was a time when I used to ignore them. I've changed my thinking on that because I think actually footnotes can be really useful, particularly when it's a case of a language or a story that comes from a tradition that's very far outside the knowledge of the average, say, English language reader or the mainstream Anglophone publisher. Sometimes there isn't a ready translation, and sometimes things can't be explained in the text, and sometimes it's necessary to have the extra explanation or extra expansion that the footnote allows. But I think they need to be treated with caution.
I had that, you asked at some point, I think you asked the reader how you feel or how they feel about leaving footnotes just away, just ignoring them.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a note in the margin, better. Because my first reaction was, if I leave the footnote, if I ignore it, I feel better about it. So I feel better about the text as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought again, but it depends on the genre, it depends on what you're reading, it depends on how much you know, maybe.
Yeah.
And it also depends on if you're willing to accept not knowing.
Yes.
And willingly ignore a footnote and just say, I'm just over it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes footnotes can feel really annoying, I think. It can be like you're having a conversation and there's someone at your elbow tugging your sleeve saying, oh, excuse me, but I wanted to say this. And it keeps interrupting. It interrupts the rhythm of the text. And I think it can be quite an annoying experience to read with footnotes. But I do think they are a necessary tool in some cases. And there are some fun books that, in fact, my latest book, which is fiction, has a rogue translator who's using all sorts of strange footnotes as part of the story. So, yeah.
And I find myself reading the footnotes anyway.
Yeah.
Going on, is there a connection between not knowing and is not knowing a female way of reading? Is there such a thing?
Yeah. Carry on.
This is one actually. The chapter about gender and the chapter about politics were probably my two favorite chapters.
Oh, thank you.
Maybe interestingly, I almost made no footnotes and I put no bookmarks in the chapter about gender, except on the first page of the chapter. And it got me thinking. And I thought about my own library, about my own books, about the things I read, and 98% of what I have is by male authors. I think I've got now about 7 books by women.
Wow. Wow, what is mine?
Thank you.
Wow. Yes, I think it's interesting. I was thinking about this in relation to the session yesterday on the fairer side of literary criticism, where we had 4 female literary critics speaking. And something that came through to me from that session was the idea that plurality is part of a female way of reading, perhaps. And so it's something that I explore a bit in that chapter, because it's the only chapter that has 2 texts at the start. The idea that maybe the female way of storytelling might involve multiple voices rather than one account, one hero's journey. I think it's possible. I think generalisations are obviously limited and challenging and problematic. And I think that we do have to be careful. But it's perhaps fair to say that to read with not knowing, there has to be a sense of humility that perhaps comes more naturally to the female reader, because and I write about my own academic journey and actually adopting a male way of writing in order to get top marks at university. So when I was at university, I observed that most of the people getting top marks in the English literature exams were men. And this didn't make sense to me, because at school, the girls had been the top scorers. And I thought, what's happened? And I realised that what I decided was a male approach to the exams, which was working, which was a bit more risk-taking, and it was about revising only a small number of subjects and gambling, but revising them in great depth and gambling that those subjects would come up, and then writing some quite kind of bold, swaggering essays that are sort of show-offy and make bold arguments and are impressive and sound good. And this is a big generalisation, and it's not true for all male students. But I deliberately set out to do that, and it worked. I got a first-class degree it's largely because I think I adopted this approach, where I consciously, and to the point I even made myself play games to keep this kind of swaggering tone. So I set myself challenge of certain crazy things I had to get in to the exams. So there was a comedian I had to mention, and a soap opera I had to mention. These things totally unconnected to the subjects I was writing about, but it was about playing a game and keeping that, what I saw as this kind of slightly male arrogance, I suppose, this kind of, I have the confidence, I can do this, which is maybe not so natural to women, and that might be because of the way we're conditioned. It might be something innate in us. So I think not knowing probably comes more readily to female readers, but that's not to say that it's out of reach for male readers. I think it's something, a tool that anyone can use. And quite liberating when you really start to think about it, because it means that, the truth is anyone can ask questions. So it doesn't matter how much you know. Anyone can be an expert in not knowing. Anyone can get top marks at not knowing. All you have to do is be open and curious and listen to your own responses. And that's really powerful when you think about it.
And maybe it's about honesty as well.
Absolutely.
Being honest about one's limitations.
Yeah, and that's something that I found I had to do in this book. So this book turned out to be much more autobiographical than I expected. And I share some anecdotes from across my reading life, from when I was quite a young girl upwards. And some of those anecdotes are quite embarrassing, actually. I share moments where I failed to understand something, or I've made an unfair assumption about something. And I do that partly to give the reader permission to also notice those things. Because I think, again, we want to think of ourselves as good people, we want to think of ourselves as open-minded and intelligent. And so sometimes maybe we hide from ourselves the moments where we're not so good, or where we judge someone unfairly, or where we get something wrong. And actually part of this is being honest with ourselves about those times, and being open to the fact that we all do that. That is part of being human. We all make mistakes. And of course, we don't want to make bad, terrible mistakes that hurt people, but the best we can do is notice when we make a mistake and think about it and learn from it. And that's empowering. You can again turn that negative thing into a positive. But so I wanted to give people permission to do that. So I'm quite hard on myself at points, and I do reveal some moments where I've not been my best self deliberately in order to make that okay.
When I received the invitation to the Duilf University International Literature Festival, I had a maybe somehow misled conception that I associated India, an English-speaking country, but not only, with Britain. And I like Britain. I've been there a few times, and I like the way the British express themselves with cheers or mate, and all the time, even people they don't know. And I associated that somehow with my upcoming visit. When I read your relearning to read, I suddenly realized that I won't do this in India. I won't do this over here. I won't use cheers or it mate. I won't. I simply won't, because I realized this could be sensitive, maybe even disrespectful towards the people over here. Do you think there is a connection between, or there could be a connection between not knowing? Can it be a form of political cowardice?
Yeah, I think there's a fine line. So in my politics chapter, I talk about how do we encounter a book that comes from a very different political perspective. And I think this is something that for all of us is becoming more and more pressing in our world today. And I think the truth is, with my website, ayearofreadingtheworld.com, I want it to be a place that is open for everyone, where everyone can come, and it's open for all voices. And part of the way I do that is to turn down the volume on my own views a little bit. So in a way, the website itself expresses my views because it's about freedom of expression, and it's about multiple voices and championing underrepresented voices. So it's clear that I'm not an authoritarian, I hope. But at the same time, I would not come out ever on that website and support a particular political candidate, for example, or make overt comments about the results of an election or anything like that. That's not my place, because I know what I'm trying to do is create a space where everyone can discuss, or everyone can share their stories. But I think we are seeing events in our world today where it is important to make a stand. And what I would say is, I think it's important, even when we make a stand against something, even when we say something is unacceptable, that it's wrong, that we leave open the possibility that that person behind it may still, at some point, say something of value, or may say something that may, even just a tiny bit, change our thinking about something. we dehumanize the other side and say, these people are beyond the pale, they can never say anything of value. You can't have a discussion if someone's inhuman. There's no common ground. And I still believe that dialogue has to be the way that we as human beings work together. We have so many challenges facing us as a human species. And so we need always that little flicker of the possibility of not knowing that there may yet be something of value I can learn from this person, even if I fundamentally disagree with their actions and with the way they're behaving, and even if I have to stand up and go out in the streets and protest against them, or if I have to go to war against them, or whatever it might be, that doesn't stop the fact that they're a human being who I might yet be able to learn something from at some point.
That's something people tend to forget, maybe somehow. And I made a note. Is this a political book?
Well, I guess a bit like I said about a year of readingtheworld.com, it is political, but not overtly political, but by nature of, I hope, being plural, being open to all, celebrating discussion and debate. It is a statement against silence and oppression. I had a very interesting dialogue with a young reader in Eritrea a couple of years ago. I get messages, particularly from young people all over the world. I'm really heartened by the fact that there are many young people, many of them in the global south, who contact me about this project and share their own perspectives on stories and want to tell me about books that they enjoy. And one of those people was a young person in Eritrea. And we actually had a call over WhatsApp. Eritrea, certainly in the UK, we're told it's one of the most oppressive or most repressive regimes on the planet. Freedom of expression is said to be very, very limited there. And I was quite intrigued to be getting messages from someone inside the country, and we had a WhatsApp call. And the call didn't go so well, because I asked her very gently about the political situation. Partly because I wanted to see if she was safe to be talking to me. I was slightly concerned that she could get into trouble. And she reacted very badly. She said she was saddened by my asking this, and every time she had an interaction with an outsider, they would leap to politics, and she wanted to share Eritrea's culture and what she was proud of about it, but she didn't want to talk about politics. And she sent me quite an angry email telling me this afterwards. And I thought about it, and I wrote back to her and I said, thanking her for what she'd shared with me about writers, and that she'd given me some interesting information and contacts and things. But I said I just wanted to gently challenge her on one thing, that she said she wasn't political. I said, I do understand where you're coming from. When I started a year of readingtheworld.com, I wanted it to be apolitical. I didn't want to have anything to do with politics. But I've realised that standing up for sharing stories is political. It is about standing up against censorship, against silencing, against oppression. And in that sense, I said, I think you are political, and I thank you for it. And I didn't think I would hear back from her, but she actually sent me a very gracious email saying that she had thought about what it said, and she realised I was right. And so I'm really grateful, and she's since sent me articles that she's written, and it's wonderful. But I think, so it's political in that sense. It's political in that I stand against, I'm very happy to say, I stand against authoritarianism, I stand against any voice that is being shut down. I cannot support that. Even if I heartily disagree with what that voice is saying, I think it's important that we as human beings stand up for each other's right to speak and be heard. Doesn't mean that what someone says always has to be followed, but we have to be heard.
And be allowed thereby to build your own opinion.
Exactly.
Paraphrase Stan Lee, do writers have great powers and therefore great responsibilities?
Well, I mean, it's yes and no, I think. I think you can overstate the importance. I mean, this is one book of hundreds of thousands of books tumbling into the world every year. Millions of books probably tumbling into the world every year. It's been lucky to have some readers and people listening to be talking about it, and that's wonderful. But it's one tiny thing, and there are many other stories, and who knows what impact it might have. But I always find it powerful when I meet a reader who has really taken something from my work and it's changed their thinking, or it has encouraged them to do something, or open their mind in even just a small way. And in that sense, there's a responsibility. But I think also it's important not to be too serious about these things, too po-faced. You know, writers have to be slightly mischievous, I think, slightly playful. Reading has to be at least partly subversive. It has to be partly rebellious, because the wonderful thing about reading is it's a private activity. No one knows what you're reading all the time. You can read what you like. And for many of us, many book lovers, it's a way of escaping. You know, you escape into a private world that may be quite different to the reality you live. And it helps you to access other ideas. And that's why politicians are often scared of it. That's why people in power are often scared of stories, because they can get into your head and they can get into your heart and they can change what you want and what you believe. But part of that is about the fact that it isn't something that someone tells you to do. Yes, of course, if you're doing a literature course, there's a prescribed set of texts, and some of them you'll like and some of them you might not know. But as a private reader, you have freedom to choose what you want to read. That's so precious. So I think writers have to approach it in that same spirit. Of course, it's a precious thing to write. I love being a writer. It's something I couldn't do anything else, to be honest. But I also need not to take it too seriously. I need to be a bit mischievous. I need to write naughty footnotes occasionally.
So I'm watching the time. Is there really no accounting for taste? Because no one knows what you think when you read something, and you can think whatever you want, and you can change your mind. But what about your feelings? Even if you try to stay open to misunderstandings, to misinterpretation.
Yeah. I mean, we all have our preferences. Okay, we all have things we enjoy and things we don't like so much. And there is the saying, "There's no accounting for taste." And that sounds true when you first hear it. You can't help how you feel about things. I think that's certainly true. You can't help if you are reading a book and you're just not enjoying it. You can't help it. And I'm not an advocate of forcing yourself through things you hate, unless you have to for your studies or whatever. But I think it's not true to say that there's absolutely no accounting for taste. Because if you look at why you like certain things, you can sometimes trace the history. So there's a story I tell in this book about when I was at university. And in the UK, there's, if you pronounce the alphabet, there are two ways of saying H. So I would say H, but some people would say H, an aspirated H. And I remember making a comment to a friend of mine at university who was from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Just an off-the-cuff comment. I said, "Oh God, I really hate people who say H." And she had a really bad reaction to that. She was really shocked. And I was a bit confused. I couldn't really understand why. And she said, well, in Belfast, where she came from, where some of you may know, there has historically been a lot of conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Protestant Unionists who want to be part of the UK and the Catholic Republicans who want Northern Ireland to be part of Ireland. And one common way that people would tell the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant was that Protestants would say H and Catholics would say H. So the IRA, for example, if they captured someone, they would get them to say the alphabet. And depending on how that person pronounced H, they might be killed or tortured or they might be let go. So for her, that was a hugely triggering thing. And that made me think, H and H, well, in the mainland UK, it doesn't have those same connotations, but is there a class thing going on there? Maybe there's something, or maybe it goes back to the Reformation when the Catholics and the Protestants split. Maybe there's some history there that I've absorbed subconsciously that has made me dislike. And it's a really strong thing to say. I hate people who say H. That's a really strong statement. That's not very me. That's not how I like to think of myself. So, yeah, I don't like that pronunciation, but I'm now married to someone who says H, and my daughter often says H, and I find myself not correcting, sometimes I feel an urge, and I know that's not wrong. It's not actually wrong. I don't love it, but that's about me. It's not about the thing. So yeah, maybe when you're reading a certain story, a character rubs you up the wrong way and you don't enjoy it so much. And that's fine. You can't help how you feel about that. And maybe it isn't a very well-written character, but maybe there's a reason why you feel that way. And that might be interesting. Is it a woman who's acting in a way that you've been taught women shouldn't act? Is it a man who's displaying traits that are typically not masculine? Or is there something about what that character is doing that challenges you and gets under your skin and taps into? So yeah, I think I would say taste is again something, in the moment you can't help how you feel, but there might be a reason why you feel how you feel, and that's interesting.
That actually got me to questioning my own view on that, because I was convinced that not being a native English speaker, I teach English in school, and I was convinced there was one pronunciation, H.
H or H?
H.
H, yeah.
So when I read that, I thought, okay, maybe I can actually consider that and tell the children I teach that this is not absolute.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so standard English, as it used to be called in the UK, or received pronunciation, as though the way of speaking was given down by the gods, which is kind of close to how I speak. That would be H. But these days there's a much flatter hierarchy of Englishes. And, as I say, Indian English, there are far more speakers of Indian English than there are people who speak like me. So really, if you're going to play the numbers game, Indian English is the gold standard these days, So I think that's interesting. And that would be great, I think. The truth is, most of what they encounter will probably still be H, because standard English is still the kind of English that is most heard outside the UK maybe, but yeah.
It's still certainly worth a footnote.
It's worth a footnote, yeah. Very good, like that. Yeah, thank you.
I have one more question about someone I understand you admire greatly. There is, I hope I'm going to pronounce his name correctly, Michel Tete Pomassi.
Tete Michel Pomassi, yeah.
Alright, okay.
Well, people in this room know Tete Michel quite well. Some people, because he was here last year. He was actually at the festival, and some people will remember. Yes, you were going to ask a question about him.
How has he influenced your trajectory, into this book?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, each chapter begins with an extract from a different book. And the final chapter begins with an extract from Tete Michel's An African in Greenland. Because I think for me, he exemplifies good curiosity. So it's a curiosity that isn't about treating other people as though they're objects in a museum that you're studying, like an anthropologist, an old-fashioned anthropologist. It's about being changed by what you encounter. So what he did when he went to live in Greenland with the Inuit, for those who don't know, I'll just say, so Tete Michel was here last year. He wrote this extraordinary memoir of running away from home as a teenager to go and live with the Inuit from Togo in West Africa, to go and live with the Inuit. He arrived there in the 1960s and wrote this amazing, joyful, curious book about his experience, his journey and his experience living with them. And something that I really loved in his work was this willingness to be changed by what he discovered. His interaction with the Inuit was a two-way process. It wasn't some superior scientist or going and studying and writing notes. It was someone who was actively sharing himself and learning and growing and changing as a person. And that's what I hope to do as well in my work. And he and I became friends some years ago because I really enjoyed his book and I championed it. And we appeared in a few things together, and he came to De Brugge at my suggestion, which I was so delighted to see him here. The wonderful thing, the coda to this book, so I end this book saying, I hope one day I'll go to Greenland with Tete Michel. Well, this summer just gone, Tete, Michelle and I went to Greenland together. We spent 2 weeks travelling along the west coast. 60 years after his first visit, we revisited many of the places that he went to back in 1965. And at one place on the bus driver said to us, "Oh, there's someone who wants to see you, Tete Michelle." And at the bus stop was this woman waiting, this old woman, and she had been a 4-year-old girl when he arrived in 1965, and he had stayed with her family for several months. And when he saw her, he burst into tears. It was such a joyful, extraordinary moment. And it's such a validation of everything he stands for, I think. So for me, he's my hero. I think he exemplifies good curiosity, and it's what I hope to exhibit in my own work as far as I can.
Thank you. So now we've got still a few minutes left for questions.
Excellent, we've got some questions, hooray! Remember, there's a signed copy for the best question.
Hello, Mr. David, and hello, Anne. I'm more of a listener myself. I'm a listener and not a speaker, but I was quite tempted by the fact that you are giving a signed copy. So, being an introvert, but still, I've gathered all my courage to ask you this question. So, during the session, you said that there is no such a thing as a bad book, and you said that mistakes, writers make mistakes, but they should go on. But as a writer yourself, what is the one advice you would give to a young writer who is thinking to write a book or is writing a book that he or she must keep in mind by writing that book? So that's my question.
Thank you. That's a good question. Thank you. So yeah, I think there are bad books. I think they can exist, and I think they come from. Well, there can be many factors, but I think sometimes it's when a writer's not being honest with themselves and not really digging into the questions they need to explore. So my advice, I think, would be to be honest with yourself about what it is that you want to say, and also be patient. It can take a long time to find the right form to express your ideas, and I think certainly when I was a young writer, I had this idea that writers sit down and they write beautiful sentences straight away. And if I'm not sitting down and writing something perfect and beautiful straight away, then I'm not a writer. Well, the truth is, writers take years honing their craft, developing their practice. It's like exercise, it's like, training for an athlete. And I certainly wrote unpublishable nonsense for at least 10 years. So, I would say be patient and be honest with yourself. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So it is not really a question, it is more of a thought that came to my mind, and I just wanted to learn your perspective on it. So as a student of English literature, I have read many books, many works, and I realized that in every work there are some elements that are inspired by books from the previous age. So my question to you is, what is originality? What even is original? Where is the origin of literature? I wanted to ask you that.
Oh wow, I mean, you could do, well, you could spend your life trying to answer that question, I think. What is originality? It's something I write a little bit about in this book actually, because I think there's a thing I call the novelty trap, which is where if you're reading something that is from an unfamiliar tradition, you can be really excited when the first time you see something and think, oh, this is incredible, this writer is a genius. And you don't realise that actually what they've done is pretty common in their kind of storytelling, or it may not even be the best example of the sort of writing they're doing. I see it sometimes with my daughters, I have young daughters, and my 8-year-old will be watching something on TV, and she'll come in and she'll be really excited, and I'll go through and it's some adaptation of some old story that maybe isn't very good, it's not, but it's the first time she's seen it, so she thinks it's amazing. So I think none of us is really placed to judge originality because none of us can know everything. And I suppose, is originality always, is it the Holy Grail? If we are creatures who repurpose stories, recycle stories, if we synthesize the strands of experience that come to us and that's how we make our art, that's okay. It doesn't need to be completely new. I don't know if it does. So I don't know if there is such a thing as originality. But if there is, I'm not placed to tell you what it is. Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
So my question is very common these days. How students always think about it, and not only students. I think many writers have felt this. You know how we have came to this point when everything feels absurd. I mean, nothing feels. We do the same thing again and again. I think Franz Kafka has always mentioned about it in his books. And I think sometimes when I write poetry, sometimes I feel absurd myself. Like, why I am doing this? Why am I even writing? Why am I even studying? And I just wanted to ask you, how as a writer, you come over, overcome from the absurdity of life and absurdity of writing. And I think my question's answer is very easily available in ChatGPT, but you know, ChatGPT can never give the experience a lived person can give me. Someone who has experienced and went through the same situation. So I just wanted to ask.
Thank you. I want to say, I thank you for that question. I want to say that I really feel for your generation, because I think the age that you are coming up in, with the challenges that there are, but also the extreme volume of communication, of social media, it's exhausting. And I would be feeling very similar to you, I think, if I were at a similar stage in my life right now. I think I'm full of admiration for the fact that you are here, you are studying, you are coming to these events, you are committed to learning, to improving yourselves at such a turbulent time, a time when things do feel so absurd, as you say. But you mentioned Kafka, and I would say that in itself shows us that this is not new. These feelings are not new. These times have come and gone. And that is one of the wonderful things that stories do, and it's why I believe in storytelling. It's a hand reaching out from a book, telling you you are not alone. I have felt this too. My life may be totally different. I may have lived 100, 200, 1,000 years before, but I felt like you do now. And that is why it matters. And that is why I hope you will find the strength to cut through the noise and keep going. Your words are worth the effort. Even if it feels like no one's listening, even if it feels like there's just loads of nonsense everywhere, it's worth it. Because if you can reach one person.
Thank you so much. Your words really helped me. I've been always dealing with this, and I think I'm glad that I've asked this question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really love the way you said the book is a hand reaching out, telling you that you are not alone. That is wonderful. And also the imprisonment experience, very touching and very moving. But actually I wanted to share, when we talked about H, how you pronounce H, or the other pronunciation. So I also had a similar condition when I first, I did my college a very long time back. So correct me if I am wrong. The letter sa in Hindi, sa. So we say we sa, but in Assamese again they say ha. So if you say Shanti book, they will say Hasi book. So that H and ha is also very similar.
Yeah.
Just want to share that.
Interesting. And is there one that is considered better than another? Or?
Hindi was all over India.
Okay.
Whereas in Assamese, that's
I see.
am I correct? So and how?
Interesting. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure. Can I announce the winner of the question competition?
Yes, please.
I would like to give it to you the question about Kafka, the absurd, if that's okay. I'll sign it for you afterwards. Yeah. My pleasure.
So we have reached the end of our session. Thank you all. And I hope you will continue enjoying the Google University International Literature Festival. Thank you.
Thank you for those engaging and meaningful questions. So, as we conclude this session on day 2 at Dibrugarh University Literature Festival, I again extend my heartfelt gratitude to David Mango and Anne Morgan. Thank you for enriching this festival with your insights. I also thank Jyotirani Das from Women's Studies Department and Rahul Bora from English Department for their extensive help. And I also thank you to our wonderful audience for being such attentive participants. With that, I formally conclude this session. Thank you.